So today we're going to shift back to the direct conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we're also going to take a look at how this Cold War and the fear of communism really affected the people in the United States. So that will be our focus today as the Cold War intensifies. In 1945, as World War II ends with the dropping of the atomic bombs, America has the sole atomic power. American leaders had refused to share their atomic secrets with other countries, but by 1949 the Soviet Union had developed their own atomic bomb, leading to this nuclear arms race between the two superpowers. In 1952, the United States developed the hydrogen bomb, which was way more powerful than the original atomic bomb, and only a year later, the Soviet Union exploded their first hydrogen bomb. So this showed that the gap that was first there between the United States and the rest of the world in developing these atomic weapons was now a lot shorter and a lot smaller, since it only took the Soviet Union 1 year after the US to develop the hydrogen bomb. It now became this really close competition of who could develop the most powerful weapons. And during the 1950s, instead of focusing on having this huge, large, very grand military force, the United States focused on developing more and more nuclear weapons for its defense instead of focusing on a physical army. But this really makes tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union even more, as they're trying to one-up each other with that nuclear arms race. And as time went on, this arms race really became out of control, to where the United States and the Soviet Union would threaten each other with their nuclear weapons. The US uses nuclear weapons as what's called a deterrent, basically saying that if Soviet Union, if you attack us with any missiles, well, we're going to nuke you. And that was the fear that, if one country used nuclear arms against the other, well, then the other was going to retaliate in a much bigger way. And so this became known as massive retaliation. One of the benefits of it was, because of these threats, we didn't have to have a very expensive large military. But the problem with that is there's no room for error. If one country nukes the other country nukes the other country back in a bigger way, well, the consequences are going to be much more deadly. Millions and more people are going to die a lot quicker. And so you see this Cold War situation is because we called this war because of the high tensions. And during this time in the United States and really throughout the world, you didn't know if another country was going to nuke another country. And so it became a very scary time for the whole world as these new nuclear weapons were being developed more and more powerfully, and the United States and the Soviet Union and their rivalry continued to grow. So now we shift from an arms race to something a little bit different. So during World War II, Nazi German scientists had made great strides in building rockets. After the war, each superpower, the Soviet Union and the United States, began its own missile program. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite into space, which was called Sputnik, and it was a little more than the size of a basketball, weighed 184 pounds, and what it did is it orbited the Earth once every 98 minutes with a radio transmitter that did little more than issue a frequent beep that allowed it to be tracked. Sputnik, though, kind of brought this fear upon the United States, so that what if the Soviets could launch missiles from space? And so Sputnik ushered in a new age of space exploration and started what was called the space race. It raised the fear that the Soviet Union could use these missiles to send nuclear bombs to the United States from the satellite. Americans in general felt that because the Soviets were able to do this, that we were falling behind them. And so the federal government started new programs in science education within schools and launched its own satellite into space in 1958. So this is what was called the space race, and we'll look at this a little bit more as we get to John F. Kennedy and in and into the 1960s. So now we're going to focus our attention to how life was in America during the Cold War, at least this early part of the Cold War. And you always hear that phrase, history repeats itself. Well, this is very evident within the time after World War II, when what was known as the Second Red Scare took place in the United States. We talked about after World War I how there was that Red Scare where people thought communism was going to take over America. We talked about Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, who arrested many people thinking that they were going to try to overthrow the government and make it into a communist state. Well, that same type of fear starts to take place again in the United States. So following World War II, Americans feared that communism was going to come and take over the United States. And President Truman ordered the establishment of something called the Loyalty Review Boards, which was to investigate individuals and any un-American activities, as they were called, such as participation in the American Communist Party. Many Americans were accused of un-American actions on very little evidence, and these victims were unable often to defend themselves or even to know who had accused them. And this process violated their constitutional rights. So through war, through times of chaos, there always seems to be an attack on our constitutional rights. And this second Red Scare, which similar to the first Red Scare, is an evidence of a time when people's constitutional rights were being violated. So that loyalty review boards looked at American people, while the government set up their own type of loyalty review board in the government itself. And they decided to conduct these loyalty checks through its special House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And this committee questioned people to see if they had any, not just ties to communism, but agreed to some of the policies of communism. This committee questioned actors, directors, writers, and others about their potential communist sympathies. Those identified as present or former members of the Communist Party were frequently what's called blacklisted, which means that if you had any association or any thought of an association with communism, you lost your job. And it was very hard to find work when you had this example or potential example that you might have had any influence or any affiliation with communism. One of the most famous people that was affected was a guy named Alger Hiss, who was later prosecuted for perjury. Those who cooperated with the committee were often asked to inform of others, so basically snitch on others that you thought would be communist. So it was just this fear where if there was just any potential, there really didn't even need to be evidence that you were associated with communism. If somebody didn't like you, they could accuse you of being communist. And for many people, especially in Hollywood and in the media, that would be the end of their jobs. As that term blacklisted was what would apply to them. So as we get into the 1950s, this scare intensifies really after the fall of China. And there was a senator named Joseph McCarthy who shocked Americans by claiming that he knew the names of hundreds of communists who had infiltrated the U.S. State Department and other government agencies. So he claimed that he knew hundreds of people who were in the government that were communists. So that Red Scare with, again, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer from the early 1920s, a little bit after World War I, took place. The same thing happened with these allegations, and McCarthy's allegations created fears of a communist conspiracy. They had hearings, and after 3 years of them, McCarthy never provided any real proof or any evidence of his charges. Eventually, he was criticized formally by the Senate, and although McCarthy never proved any of his claims, this witch hunt frightened many Americans, and Americans start to turn on each other saying, well, my neighbor's a communist. My mother-in-law's a communist. well, that's a joke, but my people I associate with are communists, and so this fear started to develop. This term called McCarthyism started to come about, which basically was a word for his bullying tactic of making harsh claims or accusations without evidence. So anytime you would claim somebody was a communist but you had no evidence, that was known as McCarthyism. So similar again to the 1920s with the first Red Scare, there was a very high profile court case that took place in the 1950s, and this was between Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were charged with selling national secrets to the Soviet Union about making the atomic bomb. The Rosenbergs were found guilty and executed for spying. And the similarity in this case is similar to the case of the Sacco and Vanzetti case in the 1920s, as many Americans doubted that the Rosenbergs were guilty. So Sacco and Vanzetti, to this day, they never found the evidence, and it's still debated upon. But in 1997, the National Security Agency, or the NSA, actually released something called the Venona Papers. And this was a secret effort by the United States to gather and decode messages sent in the 1940s by Soviet military intelligence agents. And the Venona Papers revealed the identities of several Americans who had spied for the Soviet Union during this time. And those names included Julius Rosenberg. So their execution, I mean, they did sell spies, or excuse me, they were spies that sold secrets, so they were guilty. Did it warrant them to be executed? That's another debate, but they were actually guilty. And what these papers actually found as well is that it showed that some Soviet agents had in fact found a place in American government jobs, science jobs, and industry jobs during the Cold War. So those claims by Senator McCarthy, weren't entirely untrue, as there were Soviet agents within the government, not as widespread as had been claimed, but there was some of that infiltration by the Soviets into the United States government. But this Rosenberg trial case was very highly publicized during the time. Many thought that they were innocent, but over time there was proof that they actually did sell secrets to the Soviets. For the majority of the time and the discussions that we talked about today, a lot of these things took place under President Harry S. Truman, and now we're going to look a little bit into the Cold War with President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And he was president from 1953 to 1960. Again, he was a very decorated general in World War II for his efforts with D-Day and the European attack, or European front in World War II. So as he becomes president, he actually gave control of foreign policy to his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who was a devoted anti-communist. And he sought to contain the spread of communism by making sure that the Soviets had not been able to gain any additional influences. And in 1957, Eisenhower kind of extended the Truman Doctrine. Remember, the Truman Doctrine was that any country, particularly in Europe, and then went out to even Asia, that if any country was a democratic country and was being threatened by communist rebellions to take over the country, that the United States would send economic aid or military aid to help them out. Well, in 1957, Eisenhower announced that he would send U.S. forces to any Middle Eastern nation that requested help in defending against communism. And so this extension of the containment policy of making sure communism doesn't expand became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. So you have the Truman Doctrine and the Eisenhower Doctrine, which is similar, but focusing now also on the Middle East to make sure that there would be no communism spreading. So the same thing of keeping communism under check took place under President Eisenhower. So this part will actually wrap up the beginning of the Cold War. And the time period that we were looking at was basically from right after World War II until pretty much 1960, through the presidency of President Eisenhower. We will take a look further into this Cold War because it lasted all the way up until 1989. So we'll take more in-depth looks as it in the coming weeks as we look at the presidency of JFK, Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. That's really where, and even into George H.W. Bush, really where this Cold War ends. So it lasted quite a while, but our little discussions up to this point are going up until 1960. So to recap from the presentation today, that the United States and the Soviet Union had the Cold War intensify through the arms race. That nuclear arms race and the space race started. The second Red Scare swept through America as Americans feared that communism was coming to the United States. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused hundreds of being communists. Many didn't have any evidence against them. And one of the most famous trials was the Rosenberg trials, which accused and executed those couple of selling secrets to the Soviets. They were actually proven to be doing that. And then as President Dwight D. Eisenhower takes over, he continues that containment policy of communism, expanding the Truman Doctrine, expanding containment, as he said he would give military aid and protection to countries in the Middle East that were falling under communism.